You have until noon to leave my ranch. That was the first thing the HOA president said when I stepped outside and saw 20 people waiting beyond my front gate. I looked past them at the gravel road, then back at the woman holding a thick folder against her chest. Rebecca Mitchell had been the HOA president for nearly 6 years, and she had never spoken to me that way before. Leave my ranch? I asked. She nodded as if the answer were obvious. The association has authorized the property seizure. I looked at the 20 guards standing behind her. None of them moved. None of them said a word. They were simply waiting for instructions. I asked Rebecca to show me the document that gave the HOA authority to take possession of my land. She opened her folder and handed me a notice. I read it twice. It mentioned an enforcement action, community standards, and a disputed boundary. But it did not contain a court order. It did not contain a deed. It did not contain anything that actually transferred ownership. I handed it back. This is an HOA notice, I said. It is not an authorization to take my ranch. Rebecca's expression hardened. You signed the community agreement when you purchased the property. No, I did not. She seemed surprised by how quickly I answered. I had owned this ranch for years. My grandfather had purchased part of the land long before the neighborhood surrounding it had even been developed. The ranch was not a typical suburban property. It had open fields, an old barn, several miles of fencing, and a private access road that connected to the county highway. The HOA had been created decades after my family acquired the land. I had never attended an HOA meeting, never paid HOA dues, and never signed an agreement placing the ranch under its control. Rebecca insisted that the association's records showed otherwise. I asked her to show me those records. She pointed toward the folder. They are in here. Then show me the deed. She hesitated. That hesitation told me more than her answer would have. I looked again at the 20 guards. Who authorized them to be here? Rebecca said the HOA board had approved the action. Where is the board resolution? I asked. She said it was part of the enforcement file. Then show me that. She opened another page. Still no resolution. I remained calm because I had learned a long time ago that rushing into an argument only makes it easier for someone else to control the conversation. Rebecca clearly expected me to become angry. Instead, I asked questions. That seemed to frustrate her more than anything else. Then she gave me the first real clue. This property is being brought under community control because the association has determined that the boundary was recorded incorrectly. Boundary. That word caught my attention. I had an original survey stored in my office, along with the deed, county records, and every document my grandfather had kept when the land was purchased. If Rebecca was claiming the boundary had been recorded incorrectly, there should have been a paper trail. I told her I would not leave my property based on an HOA notice. She looked at the 20 guards, then back at me. You are making this much harder than it needs to be. I smiled slightly. No. I am asking you to prove that you have the authority you claim to have. For several seconds, nobody spoke. Then Rebecca opened her folder again and pulled out a second document. Maybe this will convince you. I took it from her and read the first page. It was an older property map, but something about it immediately looked wrong. One section of the boundary had been removed from the copy. I looked up at Rebecca. Where is the original? She did not answer. And that was when I realized this was not really about an HOA violation. Someone had been looking for something on my property records long before these 20 people ever arrived at my gate. The original map was the first thing I wanted to see, but Rebecca kept the folder closed against her chest. The copy you have is sufficient, she said. I shook my head. If it is sufficient, there should be no reason to hide the original. She told me the original survey was part of the county archive and that the HOA had relied on a newer boundary map. That answer sounded reasonable until I asked a simple question. When was the newer map created? She paused again. Several years ago. By whom? She did not answer. Behind her, the 20 guards remained quiet, waiting for the situation to move forward. I turned toward my house and told Rebecca that I was going inside to retrieve my property records. She said I was not authorized to delay the process. I reminded her that the ranch was my property. Then I walked back to the house. My office was at the end of a hallway lined with framed photographs of my grandfather, old ranch equipment, and county maps dating back decades. I opened the bottom drawer of my filing cabinet and pulled out a weathered folder. Inside was the original deed, a county survey from the year my grandfather purchased the land, and several letters exchanged with the county during the following years. I placed the documents on my desk and compared the old survey with the copy Rebecca had shown me. The difference was obvious. The original showed the ranch extending along the eastern boundary all the way to the county road. The HOA copy stopped nearly half a mile earlier. I checked the dates. My original survey was decades older than the HOA development. That meant the ranch existed before the neighborhood surrounding it. The HOA could not simply rewrite the history of the property because a newer subdivision had been built nearby. I called Daniel Brooks, my attorney, and explained what Rebecca had brought to the gate. He asked me to send him photographs of the documents. I did. Within minutes he called back. "Do not give Rebecca the originals," he said. "Keep everything with you." I asked whether the HOA could legally claim the property. Daniel said we needed to review the complete chain of title before making a final determination. But he also noticed something important. The boundaries shown on the HOA map appeared to match a later development survey, not the original county record. "Find out who requested that survey," he said. "That may tell us more than the map itself." I returned outside. Rebecca was speaking with one of the guards when she saw me approaching with a folder. "I have the original records," I said. She immediately asked to see them. I told her she could review copies through my attorney, but I would not hand over the originals. She looked frustrated. "We are trying to resolve this today. Then let us resolve it with the correct documents." She insisted that the HOA had already reviewed the property history. I asked who had reviewed it. She said the HOA board. I asked when. She gave me a date from 3 weeks earlier. That caught my attention. 3 weeks earlier, I had been away from the ranch for several days. I looked at Daniel's message on my phone. He had just sent me a county record request form. Someone had recently requested the original survey from the county archive. I asked Rebecca whether the HOA had requested it. She said she did not know. I asked the association manager, but she was not there. Rebecca changed the subject and reminded me that the deadline was still noon. I looked at my watch. We had less than 2 hours. Then my phone received another message from Daniel. He had found the request. It had been submitted by the HOA office 3 weeks earlier. The name attached to it was not the association manager. It was Rebecca's administrative account. I looked back at the HOA president standing at my gate. She had known the original survey existed. She had known I was away. And now I knew she had been searching for the very document that could prove her claim was wrong. But there was still one question I could not answer. Why would she send 20 people to my ranch if she already knew the original boundary record might contradict her? The answer to that question was waiting inside an email I had not seen before that morning. Daniel sent it to me at 10:06, less than 2 hours before the HOA's deadline. The message was from a county records office confirming that someone had requested the original ranch survey 3 weeks earlier. The request came through an administrative account associated with the HOA, and the account was linked to Rebecca Mitchell. I read the message twice. Rebecca had not simply discovered a boundary problem. She had gone looking for the original record herself. I called Daniel. "Can the county confirm exactly what was requested?" I asked. "Yes," he said. "They can provide the request history, but there is another issue. The survey was not the only document requested." He sent me another file. It showed requests for an older deed, a development plat, and a recorded easement agreement. My attention stopped on the last item. "What is the easement?" I asked. Daniel explained that an easement could affect how certain parts of a property were used, but it did not automatically transfer ownership. That distinction mattered. Rebecca had been talking about taking control of my ranch, yet the records she had requested seemed focused on determining whether the HOA had any historical access rights. I walked back toward the gate and asked her directly, "Did you request my original deed from the county?" She looked at me for a moment before saying, "The HOA reviews public records all the time." "That was not my question." She folded her arms. "I do not have to explain every administrative request." I stayed calm. "You do if that request is being used to justify sending 20 people onto my property." She told me the board had a responsibility to protect the community. I asked what community interests required the HOA to take possession of land that had never been part of the development. She did not answer. Then she said something that changed the direction of the entire conversation. "Your grandfather agreed to the development terms." I asked her to show me that agreement. She pointed to the older map. "It is in the records." I told her the map she had shown me was incomplete. She insisted it was the version the HOA relied upon. Daniel called again. "Ethan, I found the development plat." I stepped away from the gate so I could hear him clearly. "There is something important on it." He explained that the original development plat did not include my ranch inside the HOA boundaries. Instead, the ranch appeared as a separately owned parcel. I looked across the gate at Rebecca. 20 guards were still waiting. She was asking them to prepare for the noon deadline while I was holding records that directly contradicted her claim. Then Daniel found another detail. A later map had been filed years after the neighborhood was established. That later map showed part of my ranch inside the development boundary. But there was no recorded transfer document attached to it. "So someone changed the map without changing the ownership record?" I asked. "That is what it appears to show," Daniel said. My frustration finally turned into something more useful: certainty. This was no longer a disagreement over how an HOA rule should be interpreted. There were 2 conflicting maps, one original deed, and no clear document transferring my land into the HOA. I asked Daniel what I should do next. "Preserve every record," he said. "And do not let anyone remove or alter anything on your property while this is being reviewed." I looked toward the 20 guards. Then I checked the time. 10:43 in the morning. The HOA deadline was less than 90 minutes away. Rebecca had the people, the paperwork, and the confidence. What she did not have was the document that could legally transfer my ranch to the association. And I was beginning to suspect that someone inside the HOA knew exactly why that document did not exist. At 11:02 in the morning, Daniel called with the document that changed everything. "Ethan, I found the original development agreement." I stopped walking. "What does it say?" There was a pause. "Your grandfather's parcel was specifically excluded from the HOA development." I looked through the gate at Rebecca and the 20 guards standing behind her. The deadline was less than an hour away, yet the document in my hand could prove that the HOA had no ownership claim over the ranch. I asked Daniel to send me a copy immediately. He did. The agreement was signed decades ago by the developer who created the neighborhood and the county officials who approved the development. The ranch was identified as a separate parcel. It was not common property. It was not part of the subdivision. And most importantly, there was no clause transferring ownership to the HOA. I read the document slowly. Then I noticed something else. A later amendment referenced the ranch boundary but did not contain a signed transfer. Daniel confirmed it. They changed how the property was shown on a later map, but there is still no recorded conveyance. I looked at Rebecca again. "You knew about this agreement, did you not?" She said she had only seen the newer records. I asked why the HOA had requested the original survey 3 weeks earlier. She said she could not discuss internal administrative matters at the gate. I asked why 20 people had been sent to my property before the board had resolved the ownership question. She said the board had determined that immediate action was necessary. "Based on what?" I asked. She pointed toward the newer map. Daniel heard the exchange through my phone and told me to ask one more question. "Ask her whether the board has a signed document transferring your property into the HOA." I did. Rebecca looked down at her folder. The board has documentation supporting its position. That was not my question. She remained silent. I repeated it. Do you have a recorded transfer document? She finally said. I would have to check. That answer was enough. If the HOA actually owned the property, the document should have been easy to produce. Instead, they had 20 guards, an enforcement notice, a newer map, and no recorded transfer. Daniel then sent me a second attachment. It was an internal HOA memorandum dated 2 years earlier. The subject line read, Boundary Review. I opened it. The memorandum stated that the ranch appeared to remain separately owned and recommended that the association obtain legal confirmation before taking any enforcement action involving the parcel. I read that sentence twice. The HOA had known about the uncertainty for 2 years. Yet Rebecca was now standing at my gate telling me I had less than an hour to leave. I asked Daniel who had signed the memorandum. He gave me the name of the association's former legal consultant. Then he said something even more important. There is a note at the bottom. I opened the document again. Under the recommendation was a handwritten entry from the former HOA president. Do not proceed until ownership is confirmed. That note had never been mentioned in any notice sent to me. I felt my frustration settle into complete clarity. Rebecca was not standing on a misunderstanding that had appeared this morning. The HOA had a history of uncertainty about the ranch, and someone had decided to move forward anyway. At 11:24, Rebecca announced that the deadline was approaching. I told her I would not leave my property without a valid legal order. She replied that the HOA would proceed according to its authority. Then Daniel called again. His voice was different this time. Ethan, I found who approved the request for the original survey. I waited. It was Rebecca's administrative account. I looked at the woman standing across the gate. She had searched for the document that could disprove her own claim, yet she had still sent 20 people to my ranch. Then Daniel added, And there's one more file attached to that request. You need to see it before noon. At 11:31 in the morning, Daniel sent me the file he had warned me about, and the first line made my stomach tighten. It was an internal request from the HOA office asking the county to provide every historical document connected to my ranch. The request was not limited to the boundary survey. It asked for the original deed, development plat, easement records, and any documents that could establish whether the property had ever been included in the subdivision. I read the request again. Rebecca had not been trying to confirm what the HOA already believed. She had been searching for something that might give the association a stronger claim. I called Daniel immediately. What else is attached? I asked. There is a second file, he said. It is an internal note from the HOA office. I opened it. The note was brief, but one sentence stood out. If the original boundary cannot be established before enforcement, proceed using the current subdivision map. I stared at those words. They explained why 20 people were waiting outside my gate. Rebecca did not need the original record to be correct. She needed the older record to remain out of the conversation long enough for the HOA to act. I walked back toward the gate and asked her whether she had reviewed the original development agreement. The board has reviewed the relevant materials, she replied. That was not my question. She looked at me carefully. Why are you suddenly asking so many questions? I answered, because your own records are answering them for me. For the first time, she did not immediately respond. I told her I had the original survey, the deed, the development agreement, and the internal memorandum. Her expression changed when I mentioned the memorandum. That reaction confirmed something important. She knew exactly which document I was talking about. Those are internal HOA records, she said. They do not establish ownership. I replied. The deed does. Daniel then sent me another message. He had found a meeting record from 2 years earlier. During that meeting, an HOA board member had specifically asked whether the ranch was part of the subdivision. The answer recorded in the minutes was clear. Ownership had not been established in favor of the HOA. The board had been advised to obtain legal confirmation before taking any action. Yet the current enforcement notice described the ranch as community-controlled property. I asked Daniel whether that contradiction could be documented. Absolutely, he said. Save everything exactly as you received it. I did. Then I looked at the time. 11:42. 18 minutes remained before Rebecca's deadline. The 20 guards were still outside, but the situation no longer felt like a contest of numbers. It felt like a contest between a stack of official records and a story the HOA had been telling for years. Rebecca announced that the association was prepared to proceed at noon. I asked her to wait while I made one final call. She said she would not delay. I called Daniel instead. What happens if they proceed without a court order? I asked. He told me not to interfere physically, not to argue with anyone, and to document everything. Let the records speak, he said. That was exactly what I intended to do. At 11:51, another vehicle arrived at the ranch. A man stepped out carrying a small case of documents. I recognized him immediately. He was the former county surveyor who had worked on the original development records years earlier. He had agreed to meet Daniel and verify the historical boundary. Rebecca saw him and walked toward the gate. Her confidence disappeared. Why is he here? She asked. I did not answer. The former surveyor opened his case and removed a certified copy of the original development plat. Then he looked at Rebecca and said, The ranch was never part of the HOA subdivision. Nobody moved. Rebecca looked down at the notice in her hand. We were less than 5 minutes from noon, and the document she had been relying on was about to become the weakest piece of paper at the gate. The former county surveyor's words changed the entire situation before noon ever arrived. The ranch was never part of the HOA subdivision. Rebecca stared at him as if she had expected a different answer. I looked at the certified plat in his hands and then at the 20 people waiting behind the gate. 5 minutes earlier, Rebecca had been certain the association had authority to take control of my property. Now the document she had been relying on was directly contradicted by the original county record. The surveyor introduced himself as James Walker and explained that he had worked with the county records office for decades before retiring. Daniel had contacted him that morning after finding the historical survey request. James had agreed to verify the boundary because he had personally reviewed similar development records when the subdivision was created. He pointed to the eastern boundary on the certified plat. This line separates the ranch from the development. It was established before the HOA existed. Rebecca asked whether a later map could change that boundary. James answered carefully. A map can show a proposed change. It does not transfer ownership by itself. Daniel nodded. That is exactly the issue. Rebecca looked at the 20 guards and then back at the documents. The HOA has relied on the current map for years. James replied. Reliance does not replace a recorded transfer. I could see the confidence leaving her face, but I did not celebrate. There was still a deadline, and I wanted everything handled properly. I asked Rebecca to pause the action while the records were reviewed. She said the board had already authorized the enforcement process. Daniel asked her to produce the board resolution. She opened her folder again. Nothing. No resolution. No transfer. No court order. Just the enforcement notice and the newer map. Then one of the guards quietly stepped away from the group and approached me. He looked at the documents in James's hands, then looked at me more closely. Excuse me, he said. Are you Michael Carter? I nodded. His expression changed with recognition. Were you the Marine instructor at the training program in Virginia? Rebecca turned toward us. I could tell she was listening now. I answered simply, Yes. The guard seemed surprised. I attended one of your courses years ago. Rebecca looked between us. What exactly does that mean? I did not answer immediately. My military background had nothing to do with ownership of the ranch, and I did not want anyone confusing the two. Daniel stepped in before the conversation could go any further. It means nothing legally, he said. The property records are what matter. I appreciated that. The real strength of our position was not my uniform, my career, or anyone's recognition of me. It was the deed and the certified county records. Still, Rebecca now looked at me differently. She asked, "You are a Marine instructor?" I told her that I had spent years training Marines and that my current role required me to remain calm in complicated situations. I did not give her a dramatic title. I did not need to. Then James opened another document. "There is one more thing you should see." He pointed to a notation on the original development plat. It stated that the ranch remained separately owned and was not included in the subdivision's common property. Rebecca read the line silently. At 11:57, Daniel received another message from the county. The archive had confirmed that the original survey request came from Rebecca's administrative account. He showed me the message. I looked toward her. She knew we had the records now. But she still had one last advantage. The board had not yet seen everything we had found. Then my phone rang. It was the HOA board chair. He had heard about the surveyor's arrival and wanted everyone at the clubhouse before noon. I looked at Daniel. He nodded. We had 3 minutes left, and the real confrontation was no longer happening at my gate. It was about to move inside the HOA boardroom. The HOA board chair did not wait for noon. He called us into the clubhouse at 11:59, and Rebecca walked in carrying the same folder she had used at my gate. I followed with Daniel and James, carrying the certified records that had already changed the meaning of everything. The board members were seated around a long conference table. For the first time that morning, Rebecca was not the person controlling the conversation. The chair looked at the certified development plat, and asked James to explain exactly what it showed. James placed the document on the table and pointed to the ranch boundary. "This parcel was never included in the subdivision," he said. "The original development agreement confirms that." One board member leaned forward. "Then how did our current map include it?" James answered, "That is the question you need to ask the person who submitted the later map." Rebecca immediately said the map had been used for years. Daniel opened the county record request and placed it beside the plat. "Then explain why the HOA requested the original survey 3 weeks ago." Rebecca said the request was routine. Daniel replied, "Routine requests do not usually involve a property the HOA is preparing to take control of that same month." The room became quiet. I watched the board members compare the dates. Then the chair asked Rebecca whether she had known the original survey contradicted the current HOA map. She said she had concerns about the boundary but believed the newer map controlled the process. Daniel opened the internal memorandum from 2 years earlier. "This document says the HOA was advised not to proceed until ownership was confirmed." The chair read it twice. Rebecca said the memorandum was outdated. The chair asked why the association had never obtained the legal confirmation recommended in the memorandum. Rebecca did not answer. Then one of the board members noticed James's name on an older county record. He asked whether James had personally reviewed the development boundary when the neighborhood was created. James nodded. "Yes. The ranch was treated as a separate parcel." Rebecca looked toward me. "You planned all of this, did you not?" I shook my head. "I did not plan anything. I came home because you sent 20 people to my property." She looked frustrated. "You have been withholding your identity." I asked what identity she meant. She said one of the guards had recognized me as a Marine instructor. The board chair looked at me. "Is that true?" I nodded. "I have spent years training Marines." Rebecca's expression changed. "You are the top combat instructor?" I did not answer immediately because the title sounded far more dramatic than it needed to be. Finally I said, "I train Marines. But that has nothing to do with who owns this ranch." Daniel nodded. "Exactly. His professional background does not create a property right. The deed does." That sentence shifted the focus back where it belonged. I wanted the board to understand that I was not asking them to back down because of my military career. I was asking them to follow the same records they were supposed to follow for every homeowner. The chair asked Rebecca to produce the board resolution authorizing the attempted seizure. She opened her folder and searched through several pages. Nothing. The chair asked again. Where is the resolution? Rebecca said the board had approved the enforcement action verbally. Daniel looked at the other members. None of them remembered approving a property seizure. One board member said, We discussed reviewing the boundary. We never voted to take possession of the ranch. Rebecca went silent. At 12:04, the chair finally closed the folder. Then we have a serious problem. He looked at the certified plat, the original deed, the internal memorandum, and the county request. Then he looked directly at Rebecca. Who authorized 20 people to come to this property? Rebecca had no answer. And Daniel was already opening another file on his laptop. He looked at me and said quietly, There is one more record. This one may explain why she was in such a hurry. Daniel opened the final file, and the first sentence explained why Rebecca had been rushing everything before noon. Ethan, this is not just about the boundary. I leaned closer to the laptop. The document was an internal HOA planning memorandum dated 6 months earlier. It referenced the proposed expansion of the neighborhood access road and identified my ranch as the only parcel standing between the subdivision and a planned connection to the county highway. I read the paragraph twice. The HOA wanted access across my land. But there was no recorded easement granting that access. Daniel continued reading. The memorandum recommended obtaining voluntary permission from me before the board announced the project. Instead, someone had marked the request as unresolved and attached the newer boundary map. I looked at Rebecca. You were not trying to take the ranch because of a violation. She shook her head. That is not what this means. Daniel pointed to another line. The project had an estimated value of nearly $2 million because the new connection would improve access to several undeveloped lots owned by a private developer. Suddenly, the pressure made sense. The HOA was not simply enforcing a community rule. It wanted control over the land because the ranch stood between the subdivision and a profitable expansion. Rebecca said the project had never been approved. The board chair immediately interrupted. Then why is it in our planning memorandum? She had no answer. James Walker reviewed the document and noticed something else. The proposed road followed the same boundaries shown on the newer map. This map was designed around the road plan, he said. It was not simply a correction of the old survey. That sentence changed everything. The boundary dispute was no longer just a paperwork problem. The newer map may have been created to support a future access project. Daniel opened the county request history again. The HOA had requested the original survey 3 weeks earlier, but the planning memorandum had been created 6 months before that. Rebecca had known about the development plan long before she sent anyone to my ranch. The board chair looked at her. Why was this never presented to the full board? Rebecca said the project was still preliminary. Then why did you send 20 people to seize the property? He asked. Rebecca said the enforcement action was separate. Daniel calmly placed the documents side by side. The dates say otherwise. The room went silent. The original memorandum. The newer boundary map. The county request. The enforcement notice. Every document pointed toward the same sequence. First, the HOA wanted access. Then someone created a map that appeared to support that goal. Then the original records were requested. Finally, 20 people were sent to my gate before the board had even voted on the alleged property authority. I felt a strange calm settle over me. The military career Rebecca had become fascinated with was not the reason she had failed. She had simply underestimated how carefully the records had been kept. The board chair asked me what I wanted. I said, I want the ranch boundaries restored to the official record, the enforcement action cancelled, and every homeowner told exactly what happened. I did not ask for Rebecca to be humiliated. I did not ask for anyone to lose a job. I wanted the record corrected. The chair nodded and turned to the board. We can vote to suspend the enforcement immediately. Rebecca objected. She said the association could still pursue an easement through proper channels. I agreed. If you want an easement, ask for one legally. Do not invent ownership. That sentence ended the argument. The board prepared the motion. But before they could vote, James looked at the last page of the memorandum and stopped. "There is a signature here," he said. "And it is not Rebecca's." Daniel enlarged the image. I recognized the name immediately. It belonged to the developer who had originally built the subdivision. But that man had died 12 years earlier. Under his signature was a note dated just 8 months ago. Someone had added a new authorization to an old document after his death. Daniel looked at me. "Now we know why they needed the original records." Daniel enlarged the final page, and the room became completely silent. The signature beneath the added authorization belonged to the original developer, but the note had been dated only 8 months earlier, 12 years after his death. I looked at Daniel. "Can that document actually authorize anything?" He shook his head. "Not without a valid chain of authority. And this signature creates a serious records problem." The HOA board chair immediately asked for the original file. Rebecca hesitated before handing it over. James Walker examined the page carefully and confirmed that the older portion matched the historical development records, but the newer notation had clearly been added later. The chair looked at Rebecca. "Who added this?" She said she did not know. Daniel opened the county archive request and compared the timestamps. The altered page had been scanned into the HOA records only days before the original survey was requested. That meant someone had been assembling a new paper trail around my ranch. The board chair finally understood the sequence. The HOA had wanted access to my land for a proposed road project, discovered that the ranch was outside the subdivision, searched for historical records, and then relied on a later map and questionable authorization to support an enforcement action. 20 people had been sent to my gate before the board had verified ownership. The chair turned to me. "Mr. Carter, the association is suspending this action immediately." Rebecca started to object, but the chair raised his hand and asked her to let him finish. "No one is taking this property today. We will have the documents independently reviewed." I nodded. "That is all I asked for." The board voted to suspend the enforcement notice, withdraw the demand that I leave the ranch, and preserve every related record. The 20 guards were instructed to leave the property without incident. Nobody shouted. Nobody celebrated. The room simply changed from confrontation to accountability. Rebecca sat quietly while the board reviewed the documents one final time. Then the chair asked whether she had personally authorized the county records request. She admitted that she had. He asked whether she had known the ranch was separately owned. She said she had concerns but believed the newer map justified the action. Daniel placed the original deed beside the newer map. "A map does not transfer ownership," he said. "A recorded conveyance does." The chair nodded. "And we do not have one." That sentence ended the dispute. Over the following weeks, the independent review confirmed that the ranch had never been transferred into the HOA subdivision. The disputed map was removed from the enforcement file, the notice against my property was cancelled, and the board began correcting the records. The proposed road project was also placed on hold because the HOA had no right to assume access across my land. If the community wanted an easement, it would have to negotiate one through the proper process. Rebecca stepped away from enforcement duties while the board reviewed the internal records surrounding the altered document. I never asked for special treatment because of my military career. In fact, I made that clear at the final meeting. "I am a Marine instructor," I said, "but that does not make my deed stronger. The records make it strong." My father was standing beside me when we left the clubhouse that afternoon. He looked across the ranch and smiled. "So they never owned it?" he asked. "Not once," I said. He laughed softly. "Then all those people came here for nothing." I looked back at the clubhouse. The HOA had believed the number of people at my gate would make its claim powerful. It had believed a newer map could replace an older deed. It had believed my identity would be the reason I won. But none of those things were true. The ranch remained mine because the records had always said it was mine. And when the HOA finally tried to rewrite that history, the documents were there to prove them wrong.